Welcome everybody to the Woodrow Wilson Centre. My name is Bryce Wakefield. I'm an Asia Program Associate, or the Asia Program Associate responsible for Northeast Asia at this centre. I'll just say a few words about the centre for the few of you who may not know who we are. The Woodrow Wilson International Centre for Scholars was founded in 1968 by an act of Congress. We're the official memorial, like the Lincoln Memorial or the Washington Memorial, to President Wilson. Some of you may know President Wilson was the only president to have earned a PhD, and therefore we seek to honor his legacy of scholarship and policy by bringing good scholars to talk about policy in Washington. Today's event is co-sponsored by the Asia Program. We seek to bring historical and contemporary understanding of Asia to the nation's capital, and the Kissinger Institute on China and the United States. Today's scholar is André Laliberte. He is a professor of political studies at the University of Ottawa, and he teaches comparative politics in Asia and the politics of identity. He's the author of a number of publications, including The Politics of Buddhist Organizations in Taiwan. He is also currently working on a book here at the centre, and when he goes back to Ottawa at the end of the month, on China in the international system, or how the impact of religion is affecting China's role in international affairs. Professor Laliberte, André, was brought to us with the generous sponsorship of the Luce Foundation, and I think I'll leave the rest of it up to him.
I would like first to thank the Asia Program, so Robert Attaway, Bryce Wakefield, and Sue Levenstein, and the Luce Foundation for having me here. And I would like to express my regret that I have only 2 weeks to stay here, because this was a really, really fantastic experience. So in the interest of time, I will have to go immediately to my talk. And this is about whether religion is going to be a challenge to the ability of the Chinese state to continue to govern the country. Before I present a response, the beginning of a response to that question, I always feel like when I'm addressing this issue, I need to preface it. Because of course, for all of you, I see here there's a lot of people who are experts on China or East Asia. They might think that, well, this is not the most pressing issue that China is facing. On the other hand, and that's going to be a substance of my talk, religion has been very, very important in Chinese history, and it has been, and it remains today, an important component of China's civil society, the evolution of its political system, and the different trends that this society is experimenting. I would like also to add that if we think of Chinese politics, and in particular about the process of democratization, the Chinese Communist Party very, very often reflect about the effect that religion has on political transition. You have two sets of countries you can look at to think about that. First, they look at former communist countries in Eastern Europe, and they know very well that religious organization, particularly the Catholic Church, in the case of Poland, really played a very important role in accelerating the transition of that regime to democracy, and more important from the perspective of the Communist Party, the demise of the party in power. They also look at East Asia, closer to home. They look at the Philippines, they look at South Korea, and they look at Taiwan, where religious institutions, and not necessarily important in numbers, but important in influence, and in particular with respect to their connections abroad, have been very important in facilitating, or certainly playing an important role in the transition there. But first, I would like to, in discussing this issue, explain briefly why is it that religion matters in China, even today, even though this is not something, again, that appears obvious to us. And for that, I will have to do the customary clarification about my definition of religion when I'm thinking about these issues. If we limit this discussion of religion in China to organized religions like the Catholic Church or the Protestant churches that exist in China, that are dynamic, that are important, but that represent a small proportion of the population. If we limit our thinking on religion about these institutions, of course, we will wonder what's the relevance or how important that is in China. By the way, I want to also stress that I'm interested in religion within the ethnic Chinese part of China. So I'm not going to discuss Tibet, and I'm not going to discuss Xinjiang. These issues are very important by themselves, but I think it's important to pay attention to what's happening, after all, in the most important part of the PRC, where lives, of course, the overwhelming majority of the population. But also, it's important to keep in mind that this population has an interface, of course, with the Chinese diaspora over the world. So when we think about religion, well, when I start, for example, giving my class on Chinese politics, I usually start my history of contemporary China not by talking about the Opium War, which was important, but by far most important for Chinese, the most decisive event, was the Taiping Rebellion. The Taiping Rebellion, which was a massive upheaval, was a major civil war that struck the country, and the estimates generally agreed by historians is 30 million casualties, which made this event the most dramatic, the most tragic event of the whole century. The Taiping Rebellion is seen upon sometimes by the official Chinese historiography as one episode of proto-nationalistic upheaval, but historians agree that this is really an event that has very important religious dimension. The leader of that movement, Hung Xiuquan, claimed that he was the cadet brother of Jesus and led a group of discontented peasants and tried to implement a form of utopian government which had a very, very specific agenda of putting in place a new society with a new way of thinking, a new religion, and a society that would be egalitarian and that would be utopian. In doing so, he was just reproducing a trend that occurred repeatedly throughout the long duration of Chinese history, where you had periodically, from time to time, in situations of economic uncertainties, you had groups that would be led by a spiritual leader, or rather someone using references to Chinese religions to lead his upheaval against the authorities. So in other words, that movement was, in the long history of China, a kind of repetition of different upheavals that had some religious dimension to them. But the Taiping Tianguo, the celestial heaven kingdom, was not in itself a religion like the Catholic Church or Protestant churches. That was not an organization that had a very established structure. That emerged out of the world of Chinese traditional religions, which is really the operational definition of religion that I use in my talk. That is, I don't want to limit myself to organized religions that have scriptures, that have a clergy, but rather a number of ritual practices, a set of beliefs, in other words, worldviews, that sometimes can be mobilized and can be used by people who have political agendas behind them. Now, closer to us, the second upheaval that has a religious dimension and that for many Chinese is still relevant to their contemporary history, and especially for the Communist Party, that makes sense, and that explain, and you'll see later, that explain why is it that the Chinese government still is worried about some religious trends today in China, is, of course, the conjunction of upheavals that have a religious dimension and that can also trigger foreign interference. The Boxer upheaval, actually, the Boxer Rebellion, has interesting consequences that we still live live with today, because that uprising was a very small group of people, again, discontented peasants, the northern part of China, believed that by following a number of exercises, they would acquire invulnerability against the bullets of foreigners. So this is portrayed today by the Communist Party as a nationalistic upheaval, but in fact, it was a combination, of course, of being protest against poor living conditions, the influence of foreigners, but also of the current rulers of the time, but also it has a religious dimension to give, if you like, some sustenance to that movement. And why it matters? Because that movement, again, was a threat to the regime of the time. And one of the response of that movement that quickly acquired an anti-foreign character is that it's been later on provoking an intervention from the 10 foreign powers, including the United States, Japan, and other European states. So this is portrayed today as one example of how religious upheavals, when they threaten the regime, they not only undermine the regime from the inside, but they also are likely to attract foreign intervention. And for the Communist Party, that was part of a long cycle. A cycle that came to an end in 1949 when the Communist Party took power, put an end to foreign interference, and also tried to really establish a new society where that kind of mixture between religion and politics would be eradicated. And of course, one of the ways in which the Communist Party sought to achieve that was simply by following the worldview of Marxism, Leninism, and then implement from the philosophy of historical materialism, trying to really nip in the bud future upheaval that would combine together political objectives with a religious worldview. Of course, this program of eradicating traditional religions in China was very complex, was made all the more complex because the Chinese government wanted to ensure unity within the country and had to eradicate religion not only among the Chinese but also among the national minorities. So this was an upheaval that was complex also because there were different types of religion that the Communist Party sought to somehow control, domesticate, if I may use that term. So there were religions that the Communist Party considered acceptable. But the traditional religious practices like ancestors' worship, the kind of practices that don't relate to a church or an organization were really targeted by the Communist Party as superstitions or as feudal mores that needed to be eliminated. So the Communist Party just authorized the survival of Christian churches, Buddhism and Taoism and Islam because it saw that each of these 5 religions had some utility for its governance, and I'll get into that in a moment. But before I get into that, one important thing to remember. I was talking about a few minutes ago about this recurring upheavals that mix together politics and religion. And of course, that came in a context, if you like, in reverse, where governance by political powers was intimately related to the traditional religious views of the Chinese. And you could realize that when you look at the political culture of the Chinese. You have concepts like the mandate of heaven. The title of the emperor himself was Son of Heaven, Tianzi. And you have here in Beijing a famous tourist site, which for traditional Chinese rulers had a profoundly religious significance. That's the Temple of Heaven, and that's where the emperor regularly, every year, had to perform significant rites that opened the cycle of agriculture. And this idea of the mandate of heaven was simply that the emperor was responsible to ensure correspondence between the forces of the universe or the cosmos and the working of society in this world. So the emperor, in a sense, was a bit like the Roman emperor in the West in classical times, really the chief religious figure in traditional China. Now, nationalist China between 1911 and 1949 in China was a very brief interruption in that kind of state control of religion. The Communist Party, of course, don't see themselves as religious, not at all, but they do pursue this ambition of the Chinese state in traditional China. That is, that the state or the politics is above religion. That is, the Communist Party has self-appointed authority to determine what is an acceptable form of religiosity and what should be considered superstition or feudal behavior. So the Communist Party has thought very hard about those issues, and if you look at the literature produced by the party itself, you hear very often about the religious question as being an issue that is central to the ability of the Communist Party to govern. And if you look at the organs of the Central Committee of the Communist Party, you see that along with relations with minorities, along with relations with economic actors, relations with religious actors is also considered a very important component of the United Front work that the party must continue to ensure its role. So the religious question is something that remains very important for the party, and one of the components of that United Front work is to ensure that the 5 religious organizations are going to abide by the regulations of the party, will also inform the party of activities among followers, and therefore ensure that the religious organizations are going to help the party implement its different policies. But of course, the Communist Party recognizes different religions, but they have different value in the eyes of the party. So the party has implemented an administrative structure that is very heavy throughout the country. They have put in place a state administration of religious affairs, which is branched out in every provinces, in every district of the country, and that look to ensure that the relationship between the Communist Party at all levels and the religious associations for all of the 5 religions are harmonious and are not ensuring that their activities are not against the different policies of the party. So the state administration of religious affairs is divided in a number of sections, but I would like to draw your attention to 4 of them. The first one, Bureau of the State Administration of Religious Affairs, is the one that, in a sense, is the least problematic, but the most important one, as far as the different religious believers of China are concerned. It looks after the affairs of Buddhists and Taoists, the 2 religions that are considered Chinese, if we forget for a moment the fact that Buddhism is born in India, but that's considered now a Chinese religion after 2 millennia. Therefore, the Communist Party considered that its relations with Buddhism are very important, to the extent that it even has significantly helped Buddhist temples to rebuild, monasteries to continue to ordain monks, and also to develop various Buddhist sites to attract tourists for pilgrimages. What you see here is the city of Wuxi in eastern China, where was convened a World Buddhist Forum. A World Buddhist Forum, which, according to the site of that event, was the first one of its kind since 1949. Of course, again, if you forget about the various Buddhist congresses that happened in Southeast Asia throughout the 50s, 60s, etc. But that was the first one where the People's Republic of China had Buddhist organizations coming from other countries in Asia. This event was coordinated by Buddhists in Hong Kong and Taiwan, and supported by a few Buddhists in Japan and Korea. And hence you see the utility for the Communist Party of having the growth of Buddhism in China. What you have in this photograph is, in the center, the convener of that conference, Wang Zuohan, who is actually right now, then was the vice chair, but now is the chair of the State Administration of Religion. And you have on his left Hu Poxiang. Hu Poxiang was then vice chair of the Kuomintang, i.e. the Nationalist Party of China in Taiwan, who also happened to be a vice chair of a major Buddhist organization in Taiwan. So on the right of these two men is Xing Yun, a very famous monk in Taiwan, was instrumental in organizing this World Buddhist Forum. In other words, the Communist Party is very optimistic about the growth of Buddhism and very encouraging because it believes that it's going to help smooth the process of reunification with Taiwan. But just to make sure, the Communist Party is also aware that many Taiwanese, if not a majority, is actually subscribing to the other traditional religion, that is Taoism, and therefore it is also helping the Taoist organization in China to cooperate with the Taoists in Taiwan. Except that there's a difference. Taoists, of course, are not as organized as the Buddhists. They don't have huge associations like the Buddhists, and therefore the way that the Chinese authorities try to cooperate with the Taoists is a bit more complex, a little bit less choreographed than the cooperation with Buddhists in China. So what you see here is simply one of the local leaders in the province of Fujian participating at a ceremony. But the interesting thing is that, like all officials in China, he has to be an atheist, and therefore what he's doing there might be looked upon by Taoist believers as a religious ceremony, but he will claim that it is just a form of cultural recognition of the importance of Taoism. And what you have here is celebration for the same deity on the other side of the strait, in the city of Lugang in Taiwan. And of course, there is no official there except to simply support or approve and look at that as a form of part of Taiwan's heritage. But this is not something that is coordinated or organized by officials. This is made by the Taoist believers themselves in Taiwan. So in other words, the first bureau for the State Administration of Religious Affairs in Taiwan sees Buddhism and Taoism very useful. In the case of the second bureau of the State Administration of Religious Affairs, their mandate is a little bit different and a little bit more complicated because this has to deal with two religions that have far less members, that are far less important in terms of members and in terms also of influence in China, but that do matter because simply they have co-religionists abroad. So these two associations are, of course, the National Committee of the Three Selves Patriotic Association movement of the Protestant churches in China, quite a mouthful, Sanzi in Chinese, simply the Three Selves, which is about the autonomy of the churches, the fact that they have no financing from abroad and that they look after their own theology. And you have the Catholic Church. Now, don't be misled by these two pictures, well, especially this one. You have a full church in Christmas in Beijing. Before you think that this is a demonstration that religious life for Christians and Catholics is very, very vivid and very active, you have to remember that these churches are full at capacity simply because there's too few places in which Protestant and Catholic can worship. Now, the third bureau of the State Administration for Religious Affairs, I will just mention briefly, is looking after the affairs of Muslims in China. And this one, too, has a very specific problem to deal with. Like the Christian and Protestant Association, it also is influenced by the needs for Chinese diplomacy. But also, this particular bureau for the State Administration of Religious Affairs is also dealing with ethnic minorities. The Taoist Buddhists, Christian and Protestants, with the exception of the Tibetan Buddhists, are all ethnic Chinese. But in the case of Muslims, most of them are considered ethnic minorities. Even Chinese who speak Mandarin, who consider themselves Muslims are considered by the government as a different ethnic group, the Hui. So this particular association has a different mandate. Now the fourth bureau of the State Administration of Religious Affairs is the one for which the information is more difficult to gain, because this one has to deal with all of the other religions that are not legally recognized, that were until recently not even recognized as religions, but as I said before, that were seen as superstitions or feudal practices. And this chart here is giving you an example of the problem when you look at religion in China. If you look at this section in the bottom, which is about the non-religious people in China according to different estimates, what you do have is approximately half of the population that is considered atheists or indifferent to religious matters. This is actually a rather, I would say, optimistic view if you are a member of the Communist Party, because they believe that atheists are even more numerous in China. And they believe that the number of religious people is not half of the population. But many sociologists in China today beg to differ with the Communist Party and have a different perspective. Now, the third largest part of that pie chart, entitled here, Chinese religions, is another way to define Taoists. Taoists, as I said before, are not as institutionalized as Buddhists, so it's very difficult to count them. And Taoists in China, as in Taiwan, are difficult to distinguish from people who practice more traditional beliefs like ancestors' worship and other forms of religious behavior. Then the third largest group are in orange here, the Buddhists. And that's pretty close to what the Buddhists themselves, the Communist Party, and the sociologists believe to be the number for people who identify with Buddhism. And the fourth minority includes Protestant and Catholics. And again, there's some dispute about whether there are that many Christians in China. And of course, one of the reasons that make it difficult to arrive at a specific figure is that along with Protestant Christians that are recognized, whose churches are recognized by the government, you also have people who worship in house churches that are not registered with the authorities. Finally, a last category, which is here, the traditional ethnic religious beliefs include the Tibetans and people from some of the other 54 national minorities. And finally, the last part, 2% of Muslims. The problem, again, with these numbers, there's a lot of disagreement. And if you look at more precise or more well-defined statistics and data on religious believers in China and look at the statistics produced by the Chinese government itself, what you have here is just a sample of the Bureau for Statistics looking at all the mosque, temple of all religions, churches that are present in China today. And it might look from here, this is a province of Fujian facing Taiwan. It might look to you as, very, very populated area in terms of religious temples and religious churches. But if you count them, and if you do a counting of all the religious buildings that are recognized by the authorities in China today, you arrive at the number of 77,000, which, put in comparative perspectives, suggests that you have one religious building for 16,000 Chinese. If you compare that, for example, with Canada, where you have 19,000 churches for 31 million people, that suggests that, well, Canadians are 10 times more likely to go to church than the Chinese, or to have various forms of worship. However, for those of you who have lived in Canada for a number of years or studied Canada, you know that Canadians are, compared to Americans, slightly more secular and very indifferent religious practice. So clearly, just looking at this number that are presented by the official statistics, you do have an underrepresentation of religious institutions. That is, institutions or organizations. And you can have a sense of the problem if you look at the number of believers. According to the statistics, up until 2007, the government claimed that there were only 100 million Chinese who were believing in any religion, and now that number has suddenly trebled 2 years after. It was simply that Chinese authorities were starting to listen more closely to their sociologists, who recognize that there's more believers than that. And below you have Yang Fenggang, an American sociologist who is born in Beijing, and claimed that there's close to 900 million people who are variously either worshippers, believers, or practitioners of different religions. I think it doesn't matter to really come to a precise figure at these numbers, but to have a sense that when the Communist Party is trying to regulate religion, the problem is precisely in this imprecision. Because the Communist Party is trying in those 5 religions to make it manageable, something that it can monitor and control and influence. But the problem is that religious practice in China, and certainly where we can see that happening freely, is rather disorganized not in a pejorative sense, but simply that it does not have an institution like the Catholic Church, which is so strict and rigorous in its organizational form. So what you have is a number of practices that have been, as I said earlier, considered superstition by the Chinese government. But now we're seeing a very interesting development. Social scientists, of course, up until the 1970s had no choice but to abide by the views of the Communist Party and argue with them that the traditional religious practices were superstitions. But now they have shifted, and they started to talk more about traditional folklore, which is in the middle, the character for Feng Shui Xiguan. But nowadays, I mean, recently, Chinese social scientists are coming to the realization that, well, Chinese also have traditional beliefs, which are simply other forms of genuine religious beliefs, what they call Minjian Xinyang. And the Chinese government now is starting to capitalize on that, which is the very interesting development. What you have here is, again, a third front, if you like, in the efforts of the Chinese government to work for reunification with Taiwan. What you have here is a ceremony that was held 3 years ago in central China, in the native town of Lianzhan. Lianzhan, who is here in the middle, who was the former vice president of Taiwan up until 2000, and who held an important position within the Nationalist Party, of course, until recently, and who was seen as a Chinese himself. And the Yellow Emperor cult is simply a traditional belief that was very vague, very fluid, that had many different forms in Chinese culture, but that took a more formal form more recently in the 1970s, gradually after the Communist Party made an effort precisely to achieve that end, to show that Chinese in the PRC, but also in Taiwan and all over the world, have a common ancestor. So this form of traditional belief that was, again, very undefined, was engineered through ceremony to make sure to emphasize the point that Chinese had the same ancestors. Now, of course, when you start to do that, you inevitably are going to ask the question, what are we going to do with another important personality in Chinese traditional culture? And so the question has been raised a few years ago when Hu Jintao was speaking about harmonious society, and whether This is paving the rehabilitation for Confucius. This was a theme at the end of the imperial era that was discussed by important intellectuals like Liang Qichao and Liang Qichao and Kang Youwei. They were briefly discussing the possibility that Confucianism would be the religion of China. But unfortunately, I don't have the picture to show you that museum, which is a museum of the revolution, today without that statue fronting it. Because after this was displayed with great fanfare in January, it has been removed just a few weeks ago. That suggests that the Communist Party is a little bit ambiguous about how to use traditional religious beliefs. And this one is also an interesting one, an interesting display of what do you do with traditional religious beliefs that are difficult to monitor, to control, because they don't have a formal organization. What you have here is a celebration in Hunan. Now, I just said which province, so those of you who are familiar with Chinese history have guessed probably who these people are worshipping to. I don't know if you can recognize the figure in the background, but these people here are paying homage to an important figure in contemporary Chinese history who was born in the region. This is in the city of Shaoshan, which is the birthplace of Mao Zedong. So you do have a few people who really think and worship important personalities that were deceased not too long ago. And that's a practice that was very often observed in ancient China. I'm not saying that the Communist Party is about to deify Mao Zedong. That would be really too much. But still, you see that there's this impulse, if you like, in some of the traditional religious practices. And here is the problem for the Communist Party. If you want to encourage forms of religiosity that are in tune with the traditional religious forms of thinking about religion, what you do is that you're going to encourage practices like Qigong, for example. Qigong, which was a traditional view of the world that saw the practice of some physical exercises as giving you the ability to control physical processes and therefore having consequences for the improvement of your spiritual and bodily health. Now, this is what happened in the 1990s, where you had an increasing number of Chinese who just felt that, well, since the Communist Party now is more positive towards religion, now that the Communist Party is encouraging moderate growth of institutional religions like Buddhism, Taoism, Christianity, and Islam, and seems to gradually reconsider traditional culture as something to be celebrated. In the 1990s, you had a number of scholars who said, actually, traditional culture, Chinese traditional culture, is actually even superior to Western religion and superior to Western science. So this development of Qigong was, in fact, a kind of nationalist assertion that the Chinese worldview was, in a way, more compatible with the Chinese needs for modernity. So, of course, when the Communist Party saw this kind of huge gathering in Northeast China in particular, but also in other large cities, they started to worry. They started to worry especially when more and more people were claiming that the practice of this Qigong was having very good effect for their health and therefore was contributing to helping the Chinese state save funds on healthcare. When you have those claims, it's not too difficult to imagine that it would have other consequences. Therefore, people from other religious organizations, particularly Buddhists, felt singled out or felt that this was a really dangerous competition. Of course, scientists in medical science were really becoming really worried that ordinary Chinese would just avoid going to see a physician and instead practice Qigong. So there were lots of criticism that emerged in the late 1990s against this practice of Qigong and its claim, to the extent that the largest of these groups then, the Falun Gong, decided to respond and protested to the Communist Party. And asked the Communist Party in the September of 1999 to be recognized as a legitimate religious organization and asked this campaign against it to be overturned. So there were a few weeks of negotiations between members of the Falun Gong that you see here surrounding the headquarters of the Communist Party. There were negotiations whether this organization could be recognized as representing the sixth religion of China. And you had an investigation that was conducted to see how influent was this movement. And to the shock and dismay of the then president of the Communist Party, chairman of the Communist Party, there was a realization that many veterans of the People's Liberation Army and many high-ranking retired cadre of the Communist Party have joined that association. Of course, the Communist Party knew what's the potential for this kind of organization and really decided on a clampdown against it. Now, what happened after, and what is still ongoing today, is that this organization is still alive. I wouldn't say alive and kicking. That would be really not representing the situation of that association, but it's still alive. I mean, there's still a website, a series of websites, that are operated by that association. We know that there are people still in China who are facing persecution, torture, or worse, and still practice that form of Qigong. But what really made the Communist Party becoming extremely nervous then, and still today, unlikely to relent on its repression, is that this association really embodied the perfect storm of its two worst fears. Falun Gong, in a way, represent a part of the social discontent. I'm not claiming that Falun Gong represent all of the discontent there is in China, by far, but still could represent potential for federating different discontented actors. But what in particular makes the Communist Party nervous is the fact that it is very widespread abroad. If you look at the website of Falun Gong, I believe now it's 25 different languages. So it's not really making headways among non-ethnic Chinese, but still it's very present. And therefore it seems to be part of a broader plot to undermine the authority of the Communist Party. And what I show you here, the next two slides, are just adding to that perception of the Communist Party, that foreign powers are now trying again to use foreign religions or religions in China which have international connections to undermine its authority. What you have here is the canonization of 100 saints who were Chinese, and that was not, of course, approved by the Catholic Patriotic Association by the time it was made by the previous Pope. So this was seen as simply a symbolic interference in the affairs of China, and of course this one. I could have shown you a picture of the Prime Minister of Canada, Stephen Harper, doing something pretty similar, which is to give some form of recognition to the authority of the Dalai Lama. Regardless of whatever the chief executive here or in my country was trying to do when granting such form of recognition to the Dalai Lama, for the Chinese authority, that's considered as further proof that foreign powers want to undermine their authority. So I will conclude on these notes on asking that, I was asking that question whether religion is going to challenge the state. In a nutshell, I would say that for many reasons that I hope you will see in these different elements of the question I've presented to you, it's very unlikely that any religious institution is going to present a decisive challenge to the authority of the Communist Party, because the numbers are too small. the numbers of organized religions, I mean believers in organized religions, are too small to represent a significant force for change. They are unable to federate with other groups who could have discontent with the Communist Party, and therefore they cannot mobilize, say, the workers or the peasants who are expropriated from their land. And moreover, the different religious groups in China are fragmented, and the Communist Party has proven repeatedly its ability to control those who have an organization and to limit the growth of those who are not organized in a formal way. So the 5 religious recognized organizations are not even interested in challenging the authorities. Quite the contrary. They believe that the current system of recognition works for them very well. So Catholic, Protestant, of course, not the house church. I'll be happy to discuss that with you after. But most of the followers of the organized religions, in particular the Buddhists and the Taoists, are really happy with the recognition they receive from the government. Now, if you look at the possibility that different religious believers would agree or coordinate some form of opposition to the Communist Party, that's very unlikely. Very unlikely because they have different worldviews. They don't have the same political orientations. If you think of Protestants themselves, and if you limit your observation to them only, you do have some churches that are very liberal in the, I would say, in the European sense, or the classical sense of liberal, while you would have other ones that are more conservative and that wouldn't even agree on what they would propose as a political program. And the Communist Party itself is going to be able, for the foreseeable future, to be able to manage to pose itself as an arbiter between those different religious associations and organizations. And finally, I would not leave it at this by making some sort of a warning against the problem inherent in supporting or believing that supporting religious organizations to create some sort of a democratic coalition against the Communist Party would be useful. First, the possibility that supporting a democratic coalition with religious organization would be very unlikely to succeed, simply again because the numbers are not there. And second, the greatest source of concern is that support, real or even perceived, for religious organizations in China is likely to really have serious consequences for religious believers in China itself. In other words, the support for mobilization that could be given to religious organizations in China is likely to be unsuccessful and have very dangerous consequences for believers themselves. And finally, the last thing that we should keep in mind is that, as happened in other parts of the world, increased repression of religion by the Chinese government, if it perceives that religious associations are starting to mobilize against it, is very likely to generate a cycle of radicalization in any religious associations that would feel threatened. And that's the lesson that the Chinese government is drawing from the previous religious upheavals in the past. And I will conclude on that note. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Andre, for a very substantive talk. As we are being webcast today, I'd appreciate it if, when you ask any questions, if you could wait for Joshua, you're not on, sorry, Sandy, to come around with the mic. Standard rules apply. Could you please state your name and any affiliations you might have?
Very nice talk, Professor. My name is Randall Doyle. I used to teach modern China and East Asia, Central Michigan University. I'm now at the State Department working in the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor. Two or 3 years ago, I was in Beijing, and I had a young lady come up to me, literally, in downtown Beijing. I was lost, of course. And she came and asked me if I would like to visit her church. They were going to sing songs and everything, Christian church. And I was somewhat taken aback, but I did know that the practice of Christianity does occur in Beijing and other parts of China, and other religions, obviously. And I guess my question to you is that, though you're quite right, I think there would be probably a pretty nasty backlash from the government against those who perhaps use religion to challenge the authority of the Chinese Communist Party. And yet, though, it seems to me to some degree, maybe they have no choice, but the Chinese government is playing a very dangerous game with themselves, and so to speak, kind of a Russian roulette, if you will, because they can't stop it. They allow it to occur, as it was explained to me, that as long as everybody shows up at a building like this, but there's no cross, there's no proselytizing outside, sitting on a soapbox or anything, that kind of thing, the government's willing to accept it. However, if they go beyond those parameters, then things can happen. Bad things start happening. But it seems to me that the Chinese government is trying to have it both ways, and I think to some degree it's a very dangerous game for them. Because what happens in essence, well, people just literally in masses start to not recognize the authority of the Communist Party and start to recognize religion in a very public fashion, as you showed with Falun Gong and so forth. What happens then? How can they get the genie back in the bottle when people, if there is a somewhat unification among these religions working together, what can the Chinese government do then?
Well, I couldn't agree with you more, actually. I was a few years ago, too, in Beijing at the Central Party School. And, well, I chose that topic, actually. That was not the most popular one. But it's really necessary not so much to support so much the Protestant church, but to educate the Communist Party. I'm not saying that I was contributing to that, but Chinese social scientists are working on that right now. I mean, you have many social scientists there that are studying all the variety of religious practices, and they look very seriously at how Protestant churches are doing good for Chinese society. And therefore, there's a very, very subtle and sustained effort to convince the Communist Party that they have to really loosen and relax that form of control, because that's not helping. You're right. I mean, that the more this control is stringent, the more that risk driving some people to despair and doing things that are really, really objectionable. But at the same time, there's a majority of the religious believers are people of goodwill and people who would like to contribute to Chinese society, and not people who are against the government. And the problem is that as long as the Communist Party think that having a form of organization is a threat to its rule, it's going to be very difficult. And I'm afraid that churches by themselves will have to work very hard, and it's important that non-church members, not only democratic movement, but I really believe in epistemic communities, that is people in academia or people in research institutes, in think tank, journalists, they try to educate, again, the members of the Communist Party that it's so counterproductive to try to limit this. And instead, they should look at, what's the benefit they would gain from having a more liberal policy.
Up the back there.
Hi, my name is Matthew Robertson. I work for the Epoch Times newspaper. I was fascinated by the presentation. I have two questions. One is specifically, how will the religious policies with Taiwan, how is that going to help unification? It seems symbolic. It's not clear how it will have a practical consequence. And the other is, you said you're at the Central Party School. It's a broad question. I'm interested in how Falun Gong is discussed today among academics. I mean, is it still a major taboo? When you raise it, people just shut off? Or, I mean, how do they talk about it? I mean, there's obviously not people studying it, I would presume, because it's persecuted, but how do people talk about it in your experience?
Okay. I'll answer to your second question first. At the Central Party School, I was asked that question from students in the back. I was asked question about Falun Gong because, of course, the scholars themselves at the school were very nervous about discussing that. And I raised pretty much the point that I raised before about, well, why don't you just let these people, practice their beliefs? And you'll see maybe that will be good for harmonious society. And students in the back kind of opine, well, that makes sense. But that being said, in some context, when it's scholars meeting people from the Religious Affairs Bureau or State Administration of Religious Affairs, when it's in a formal context, you just don't even mention it. You just don't talk about it. When you are scholars with scholars, anything goes. I was in the city of Hangzhou. I was in a session like this. And, I was talking about Buddhist charity in Taiwan because I felt, well, this is a safe topic. And then one of my colleagues said, what do you think of Falun Gong? Oh, so I was really pleased that there's frankness among scholars to talk about most issues. Your first questions about what are party policies going to facilitate cross-strait relations? I don't think so. I think that I think that the Communist Party is deluding itself if it believes that making overtures to Buddhists in Taiwan, that's going to improve the situation. Certainly the leaders of the Buddhist organizations might look at it this way. Certainly Xing Yun. I'm not so sure about the other large organization, that is Tzu Chi. Most Chinese Buddhists, I'm not sure if they even care. But the Communist Party think, well, that's part of its old-fashioned United Front work policy, and it thinks that it can try to have as many allies as possible. But the fact is, Taiwanese Buddhists are really angry, many of them, not all, but many are angry at Xing Yun because they believe that he's selling out Taiwan to the Chinese.
This gentleman here.
Hi, Eric Gomez. I study at the State University of New York at Geneseo, and I'm an intern at the U.S. New Zealand Council down here for the summer. And so you made the point that religion isn't going to be a major challenge to the Communist Party, at least in the immediate future. Are there any other organizing things that you see being a challenge to them, like any demographics, any ethnic groups, any like economic groups? Specifically for me, as China has gained a lot in economic prominence, it's now the second largest economy in the world. Do you think that some sort of rising middle class will get upset at the Chinese government if they have more access to a Western education, let's say if they want to go abroad? I don't know if Chinese frequently go abroad, but if they do and then they see internet freedoms being denied and other stuff like that, do you see that being a rallying point anytime in the near future?
That's a very good question, but a very, very difficult one to answer because there's so many possibilities. But no, there's no single actor that can challenge the Communist Party. There's a variety of discontent. There's a variety of sources of discontent. As I said before, briefly, I talked about labor. I talked about people who are expropriated from their land in the countryside, people who suffer from environmental degradation, etc. But the problem is that there's no organization that federates this discontent. The Communist Party has been very good at really eliminating every alternatives, and that's really what makes me very pessimistic, is that it's the old-fashioned model. I know it's not popular now talking about totalitarian political system. Of course, Chinese society is plural because you have a vibrant civil society, but in terms of the politics, there's really no alternative. And unfortunately, the Communist Party of China is not interested in following the Taiwan model, which I thought was a nice way to, okay, you don't want another political party, but you still have people outside of the party who can run to elections. But the Communist Party has rejected that. They have rejected the idea that there would be different wings of the party. Lately, there were attempts by individuals to run for the National People Congress, an assembly without teeth. But nevertheless, they could not even run. There's pressure now to prevent them from running. So I really don't see how the transition is going to happen soon. And I'm not either saying that the Communist Party is going to stay forever. Now, the middle class is still a minority. There's still probably 60% of the population, which is very poor, destitute, living in the countryside. And people in the middle class now rather fear that if there's a democratization in China, well, they might have to face demands that they could not face.
Good.
My name is Arnold Zeitlin, and I've been teaching in China for the past 8 years. What is your assessment of the scope and impact of the house church movement, especially as it's exemplified by the Shouwang Church demonstration?
Well, I haven't studied closely the house church, so I'll be very, very cautious in assessing their future potential. I might actually be more likely to talk about the Catholic Church because I'm slightly more familiar with it, and I suspect that might be something in common with the Protestant house churches. Well, the dynamic between the churches that are recognized and those that are not is very often simply that at the local level, there's simply not enough room for people to practice their religion. And people would realize that there's no point in trying to register if you don't have any physical support. So it's not necessarily a challenge to the authorities. One could assume easily that if the local government said, okay, we're going to give you a place of worship, well, they might just register. It's really, again, a clear indication that, for example, the party really seems to favor Buddhists, because there's no shortage of Buddhist temples that are rebuilt, renovated, or even built out of nowhere. This picture I showed you of Wuxi, for example, was temples that were built in a place where there was no significant Buddhist activity then. So I assume that for the house churches, I would hope that a similar dynamic might prevail. I'm sorry. Yes. Well.
You don't see any antagonism between house churches and registered churches.
Okay.
You don't see any harsher response to house churches.
Okay. I would respond to that question by making another argument with which I'm more familiar. It's simply the denominational variety, especially of the house churches. The Communist Party has tried since the beginning to really have one organization that lumped together people with different theological understanding of what is Christianity. And of course, house churches not being monitored by the official church are free to develop and nourish and nurture their own theologies. And I remember that a few years ago there was this story about the different churches, the Shouters and the Orient Thunder, that were really fighting each other to convert people. So it's not so much, well, of course, if these people disagree so much on the theology, they are likely to disagree with the official theology that is promoted by the official organization.
Thank you very much, Professor. My name is Aditya Rao. I'm from the University of Alberta in Canada. My question is very, very simple. It's what are your thoughts on any potential consequences that the Arab Spring might have on movements in China?
Well, one of the sad consequences is that now you cannot write anything that has jasmine on it. That you probably are aware of that, right? As soon as the Arab Spring occurred, the Chinese authority were really, really nervous that it could have a contagion effect. But I'm afraid that there's situations that are very different here. You have lots of people who are discontent, but the Communist Party, in as much as it is seen as an oppressive force, is not one dictator. It's just not one family that control everything. So to oppose the Communist Party is a much more formidable actor to oppose than simply one dictator, one autocrat. So I think that the Communist Party has really exaggerated the threat that the Jasmine movement presented.
Al Milliken, AM Media. What kind of dialogue has there been with other communist nations about religion? Do you think the Chinese see and believe serious mistakes have been made in, regarding religion in North Korea, Cuba, and the former Soviet Union?
So your question is that is the Communist Party likely to recognize mistakes it has made? Or
I mean, do they study these other communist nations and evaluate how their governments are dealing with religion?
Okay, in the case of Cuba, I'm not very familiar with Cuba, except the only thing that I know that quite strike me actually is that Fidel Castro seemed to have a fairly good relation with the Catholic Church. With respect to North Korea, what religious policy is there? This is a country where you have no religious association with a visibility comparable to the Chinese officially recognized religious associations. In China, at least, you do have, even when we talk about the house churches or the dissident Catholic Church, if I may, you don't have something comparable to North Korea. So it's very difficult to know what is the thinking of the leadership in North Korea about, the leadership in China about these situations. I don't think they look at it as a model.
Like the Soviet Union, do they see that playing a role in disrupting the communist system in the former Soviet Union?
They look at the policy of the Soviet Union as an example to follow?
Maybe not to follow.
Yeah, not to follow, yeah. Well, but that's a different matter, because the Communist Party religious policy was not an important component on the failure of the regime to sustain the different challenges that it faced. I mean, the opposition to the Communist Party of the Soviet Union was not, as in Poland or as in East Germany up to a point, was not led by religious associations, because the Orthodox Church was almost completely controlled by the Communist Party in a way that really is similar to the Buddhist Association of China. So the dynamic of religious-state relation in the Soviet Union was slightly different from China, because they didn't experience the presence of a movement like Falun Gong.
Just as Sandy is going around, what about so then what about Poland, and what about East Germany, and what about even non-communist autocracies like, I don't know, South Korea before the 1980s? Or, I mean, is there any evidence that
Well, one thing that makes China different from these countries, if you look at Poland, Cuba, North Korea, well, North Korea, no, North Korea is a case in part, but if you think of Poland, Cuba, and the other countries in Central Europe, you had countries which were, for the most part, a single religion society. So countries that were either all Catholics or Orthodox, while in China you have a variety of religion. And as I said earlier, the Communist Party really believed that it can stand above those different religions and act as more as an arbiter that can assert for itself a role to ensure that none of them is too influential in the rest of society.
Hi, I'm Cooper Reeves from the Department of State Office of International Religious Freedom. And I had two questions, really. The first is something that I've personally struggled with for a while. Is it's basically why the Falun Gong? You know, why would China choose to persecute this religious group while letting others go? And what I've really it has to come down to either ideology or organizational capacity. So, China had its problems with, say, the Catholic Church, years ago when they, had problems with the Pope. So that would be ideology. But it seems more for the Falun Gong, it was their organizational capabilities. So I had, wondering what you thought about that. Ideology versus organizational capabilities. Where does the fear arise? And second off, this is more have to do with domestic politics here. But it seems like China is becoming coming up more and more in the Republican primary specifically. as, the new boogeyman. It used to be the Soviet Union, now it's more towards China. And a lot of times, these candidates bring up religious issues, human rights issues in China, the Falun Gong allied. And do you think, there's anything constructive about that at all? Or do you think it'll be able to, any kind of pressure on the Chinese government? Just kind of a general question.
Okay. Well, for the first question, I would not hesitate. It's not so much a question of ideology. It's more a question of organizational capacity. When I mentioned about especially the claim that you practice Falun Gong's Qigong, and then you say that you're going not to necessitate healthcare, official healthcare. So the Communist Party really saw that there was a serious problem of a group of people that were getting organized that could even mobilize the population to undertake some behavior. Now, again, the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches are more difficult to clamp down against because they have followers outside. And the case of both Protestant and Catholic churches, we have to remember it's not only here, it's also in Africa and Latin America, countries with which the Communist Party want to develop good relations. Now, with respect to the pressure that Republican politicians would make to China, God forbid, if I may, I hope they won't go that road. I think it's not gonna help religious believers in China, period. It's just going to, increase the hostility of whatever hostility the Communist Party may have to people who protest against repression of religious freedom.
Very good. Okay, if there are no more questions, I think we'll wrap things up there. And if you'll join me in thanking Professor Laliberté for a stimulating conversation.